Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Xi Zhi. Coming up in this edition, Russia and Ukraine have resumed attacks on each other after a 30-hour truce over the Easter weekend. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings are underway in Washington with a focus on tariffs. And Egypt has inaugurated the headquarters of the African Space Agency, marking a milestone in space collaboration on the continent. We begin in Europe. Russia and Ukraine have resumed attacks after a 30-hour Easter truce over the weekend. Both sides have accused each other of violating the ceasefire. But Russian President Vladimir Putin has proposed bilateral talks with Ukraine for the first time since the early days of the conflict. Ukraine will hold peace talks with the US, the UK and France in London on Wednesday. Dasha Chinicheva has more from Moscow.
Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed that following the 30-hour-long ceasefire for the duration of Easter weekend, the Russian armed forces have resumed the fighting and the achievement of the goals of Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine. But also, the Russian Ministry of Defense has said that Russia has been abiding by this ceasefire while accusing Ukraine of multiple violations and provocations. The MOD says there have been up to 5,000 cases of the Ukrainian violation of this Easter ceasefire, suggesting that there have been artillery and drone strikes from the Ukrainian side, with the Ukrainians attacking the Russian border regions of Belgorod, Bryansk, as well as Kursk. We also hear in the MOD say that there have been 6 attacks by the Ukrainian troops to attack Russia's Kursk region as well as the Donetsk region. Those attacks have been repelled according to Moscow, but we are hearing about the casualties among the civilian population in the Russia's border regions, including those killed. The Russian president has most recently said that Moscow is always open and positively treating any possibility of peace negotiations and peace initiatives, and hopes that the Ukrainian side will also have the same attitude. Moscow now said that Kyiv is trying to take the initiative on the ceasefire in its own hands, and the Russian president has also suggested that it is probably the Western countries that have advised Kyiv not to reject the Russian proposal of this ceasefire.
That's Dasha Chinicheva in Moscow. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has affirmed his country's proposal to end attacks on civilian targets. He added that he's ready for any form of discussions to achieve it. Audrey McAlpine with the Associated Press has more from Kyiv.
President Vladimir Zelensky reached out to President Putin asking for him to sign a 30-day ceasefire against civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure. Zelensky has said he would answer silence with silence, and he would mirror the Kremlin's response. Now, a lot of people thinking that certainly that the Kremlin is not serious about a peace deal. They think that perhaps he just answered the Easter ceasefire in response to this. We proposed this Easter ceasefire to placate to President Trump, who on Friday said that he would perhaps move on from a peace deal if the Ukrainian and the Russian side did not reach any sort of progress. Now, a lot of people in Ukraine believe that Russia is not serious about a peace deal. A few days ago, I was with the Ukrainian Navy on one of their Black Sea patrols, and they said that strikes had actually increased, or rather attacks from Russia over the Black Sea had increased since February, since these ceasefire talks began. So in general, the feeling here is that while Russia might say that it wants peace, they don't believe that that's actually what they would like, that in fact they don't even want a ceasefire.
That is Audrey McAlpine with the Associated Press. In North America, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings in Washington are focusing on tariffs. This year's gathering got underway amid upheaval in global financial markets. There's also a question about whether the United States will keep funding these two institutions. Owen Fairclough has more.
When the International Monetary Fund last took stock of the global economy, just 3 days before Donald Trump was inaugurated as US president back in January, the outlook looked rosy, especially for the US, with the IMF forecasting a healthy 2.7% growth in 2025. But now delegates from across the world are gathering here in Washington, D.C. for the annual spring meetings the IMF hosts jointly with the World Bank, just weeks after Trump sank global stock markets by announcing hefty tariffs on trade partners just about everywhere.
Most of those tariffs have since been postponed pending negotiations. But how much have Trump's actions and the ensuing retaliatory tariffs changed the landscape? The head of the IMF gave a strong hint while previewing these meetings last week.
What we see this time around is a very sharp increase in uncertainty. But the economic fundamentals are still quite strong. This is why when I spoke about what you should expect from us next week, I stressed there would be markdowns but not recession.
No recession, but the extent of those growth forecast markdowns will be laid bare with policymakers looking for solutions on trade and tariffs.
Ultimately, trade is like water. When countries put an obstacle in the form of tariff and non-tariff barriers, the flow diverts. Some sectors in some countries may be flooded by cheap imports. Others may see shortages.
Other items on the agenda include the IMF's recent $20 billion bailout for Argentina and the first Syrian delegation visit to this forum in at least 20 years.
If Trump and tariffs remain the overarching talking point at these two institutions this week, one discussion on the sidelines is likely to be Washington's continued financial support for them. As the White House reviews its membership of international organizations, the head of the World Bank said last week he did not yet know if the US would commit to a $4 billion fund to helping the world's poorest countries.
That is Owen Fairclough in Washington. Turning to the Middle East, medical teams in western Yemen are struggling to treat dozens of injured people following US airstrikes on an oil port. US airstrikes on Yemen have killed over 240 people in Yemen over the past month. Local hospitals are facing shortage of resources and lack of international support. Ahab Alfandi has more from Hodeidah.
In hospitals across Hodeidah, 170 people are being treated after being wounded in the U.S. airstrikes in Ras Isa port. They are receiving care under difficult medical conditions. Among them is Hamid Aidani, a port worker who was immobilized by shrapnel injuries.
When we arrived at the Ras Isa port dock and were getting out of the car, the airstrike started. There were 8 double strikes. That means 16 explosions. I was hit by shrapnel. Thank God I survived. I tied my leg. I saw it was almost cut off, but still hanging. I tried to crawl to a safer place while the fire kept chasing us.
Medical services have sharply declined, and most health facilities are no longer working. The health sector in Hodeidah is among the most affected. The crisis has worsened after UN agencies cut their support and the U.S. stopped funding organizations that back the health sector. Still, health officials say they are doing their best to handle the pressure caused by the latest airstrikes with support from both public and private sectors.
There are difficulties, complications and real pain for the wounded, but the health sector, with the help of all hospitals, their staff and strong public support, will be able to handle any cases. The government and the private sector are working together to face the situation.
The health crisis in Yemen is one of the country's biggest humanitarian disasters. More than 17.8 million people urgently need medical help. Women and children are especially affected. Malnutrition rates are high in many areas, including Hodeidah. Despite the harsh conditions and limited resources, doctors in Hodeidah continue to perform their duty. They provide care with what is available, facing daily challenges to save lives in struggling healthcare system.
That was Ahab Alfandi reporting. In China, the country and Indonesia have agreed to hold talks and support each other in their development. Foreign and defense ministers from the two countries had their first 2+2 dialogue and reached consensus on security cooperation and maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea. They also discussed the Belt and Road Initiative and trade. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held separate talks with his Indonesian counterpart and urged joint efforts to pursue modernization. Wang Mongjie has the story.
Beijing hosted the first ministerial meeting of Foreign and Defense Ministerial Dialogue between China and Indonesia on Monday, with a memorandum of understanding on establishing a comprehensive strategic dialogue mechanism signed by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his Indonesian counterpart. After the signing ceremony, foreign ministers and defense ministers from both sides briefed reporters on the consensus reached during the talks.
It marks the beginning of a new chapter in strategic mutual trust and political security cooperation between our two neighboring countries, two emerging economies, and two developing countries.
Deepening cooperation in the field of defense security will definitely provide strong support for building the China-Indonesia community of a shared future.
The two foreign ministers also exchanged views on bilateral ties and cooperation in a separate meeting.
Strengthening our mutual trust and cooperation has sent signals of solidarity and openness to the world. It is important.
I have shown that all these years our relations has been keep increasingly progressing, and we want to continue.
A reception was also held Monday to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and Indonesia.
China and Indonesia are good neighbors and good partners. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said China stands ready to work with Indonesia, following the strategic guidance of the two presidents, and making full use of this mechanism as an important platform to elevate mutual trust and coordination into a higher level.
That was Wang Mongjie reporting. Finally, in Africa, the African Space Agency headquarters is officially running in Egypt. It marks a milestone in space collaboration on the continent. Egypt's foreign minister says the agency is also open to cooperation with international partners. Abd al-Marouki reports from Cairo.
9 years after the African Union adopted a continental space policy and strategy, the Africa Space Agency inaugurated its headquarters in the Egyptian capital, Cairo. With this step, the AFSA can finally pursue its mission to harness space science and technology for Africa's socio-economic development and sustainable development goals.
African ministers as well as directors of continental and international space agencies came to the Egyptian space city to celebrate this landmark step for Africa. All of them pledged to support Africa's space ambitions. The European Space Agency marked this historic day by signing several cooperation agreements with the world's newest continental space agency.
The mission of the African Space Agency is to collaborate all the space programs in Africa, being it space exploration, Earth observation, astronomy, satellite communications. It's an already existing framework from the African Union, but it has now established on its own. So it's not going to start its work, work has already started.
The space industry is financially demanding and requires sophisticated technology to run. For Africa, that's still a major challenge. One of the roles of the African Space Agency is to coordinate efforts by national space agencies to complement Africa's space research and capacity building efforts.
All the nations cannot invest heavily in the space sector because investment in space is very, very capital intensive. Coming together in a union like this is the best way to go. Africa is massive landmass. The only way you can manage the resources of Africa and then the diversity of Africa is to use space science and technology. No other means upon which we can do this thing.
China is expected to be one of the main global partners of the African Space Agency. The Egyptian space city has a strong foundation of Chinese space technology, which empowered Egypt with a satellite assembly integration and testing center, as well as expanded the country's remote sensing abilities and space images analysis.
It's quite interesting when you are in space. Most of the geopolitical zones or political is totally different. When you look at the International Space Station, you have all the nations coming together, especially the Americans, the Russians. The role of the China supporting the Egyptian Space Agency also and supporting the African Space Agency is a role that is well welcome and is an example for others to follow.
By hosting the African Space Agency, Egypt is solidifying its leadership role in Africa's space ecosystem. It is a commitment from the North African country to nurture space research, technology development, and innovation across the continent. AFSA is not expected to build rocket ships and send humans to space, but will instead focus on Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation and positioning, as well as other space sciences and astronomy.
That was Abdel Al-Marouki reporting. Now recapping the headlines before we go. Russia and Ukraine have resumed attacks on each other after a 30-hour truce over the Easter weekend. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings are underway in Washington with a focus on tariffs. And Egypt has inaugurated the headquarters of the African Space Agency, marking a milestone in space collaboration on the continent. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.